All right, we are live this evening. Thanks to all of you who come out. Thanks to you who view the streams. We appreciate your support. We're thankful for every one of you, and we pray that you've had a wonderful day in the Lord. We're looking at Isaiah chapter 50, and we're talking about an interesting subject. It is walking in the light of sparks. So when we think about a spark, to think about that for just a moment. Now, probably each one of us at some point in our life have played with a event around July 4th or somewhere around that, something called the sparkler. You know, you light the end of the sparkler, it kind of sparkles little lights, and you wave them around and make different shapes. They don't last very long, but it's a very interesting thing. Now, I hope that you've not had the experience that I had, as I actually burnt myself on a sparkler, I think at least once or twice. One of the hazards about sparklers is they always end up on the ground, and somebody always ends up stepping on them when they are still hot. But I know of that happening at least twice. But when I'm talking about sparks, I want you to think about if you were trying to use a sparkler to get around at night. All right, we would find it extremely difficult. Well, now, for one, it doesn't actually stay lit that long. You know, it stays lit long enough to show, make different shapes and have a fun time with. But it really doesn't hardly stay around long enough for you to be able to really get anywhere. And I will tell you that it would be very hard to do. You would quickly find yourself in trouble. Think about if you were trying to get around your house at night, there wasn't any lights on, and the only thing you had to light your way was a sparkler. Well, you would find it very difficult. You would probably have trouble. You might be able to navigate yourself maybe to the bathroom, or maybe even possibly, sort of get dressed, maybe get enough light to figure out which way the tags are, and maybe get some clothes on. It would be very difficult to do. I would just imagine almost anyone would not really want to try to cook a meal with using a sparkler as the main light system or anything else. Why? Because it doesn't give much light. Right? There's something called a lumen. Now, of course, if anyone that's went out and ever tried to purchase light bulbs, if you really looked close to the package, you'll find this information about lumens. And it will say that this particular light bulb gives maybe 800 lumens or 900 or possibly even more. If it's a floodlight, you might see something like 2,700 lumens, or maybe even into the higher thousands, depending on how big the light is. There's also lights that are very small lights that only give off, say 200 lumens or 300s. It'd be a very weak light. There's even little pin lights that only give up about 20 or 30 lumens, which just is hardly enough even to get any light, but maybe if you were in the complete dark, might give you a little bit of light. I bring these up because these are very physical things that we're aware of. Besides, if you were the average room light, if I remember correctly, is that you would need about 2,000 lumens in a living space, where people are like a living room or something like that. I think bedrooms are closer to 1,000. But all of these light things, and why? Because light's really important. If you don't think it's important, just turn off the lights and you'll find that it is. I mentioned one time that I went to the Mammoth Cave. It's in Kentucky. I've actually been to several caves. Squire Boone Cavern's another one. But the Mammoth Cave was very interesting because it's a very large cave. Besides, there used to be 8-hour tours, and now they've reduced them to 4 hours because some places in the cave are quite dangerous at certain times due to water levels. But at one point, as we were back into the cave a good ways, they turned off all of the lights. They actually have, obviously, lights that are artificial there. And it was an amazing thing that happened. I don't think that you'll ever see as dark of darkness as it was in that cave. We were probably a good hour into the tour. We were very deep into the cave. There wasn't lights anywhere. And when they turned off the lights, it literally was a darkness you could feel. Like you couldn't see a thing. You couldn't see anybody even a foot away from you. You couldn't see your hand. You couldn't see anything. There was no light at all. And it actually, you could feel it. It was like there was a thick darkness. So, when Isaiah is going into this evening, the reason why I brought up light and lumens and this type of thing is because Isaiah is going to compare lights this evening. In Isaiah chapter 50 and verse number 10, here's what it says. It says, "Who is among you that feareth the Lord, that obeyeth the voice of his servant, that walketh in darkness and hath no light?" So here Isaiah says, who is it among you that's walking around and doesn't have any light? You know, now, obviously we've been talking about the physical presence of light. That's very important. We thank the Lord for lights this evening. You know, the lights for up here on the platform, the lights out in the pew areas, and we're thankful for lights, you know, all of them, from the back all the way to the front. But spiritually speaking, light is extremely important. A person has very little knowledge about the things of God, has very little light, will find difficulty in where he's going. You know, probably one of the saddest things that we're seeing face our society now is there are a lot of people that have very little experience with church. You know, there was a time when most young people went to church, whether or not they were, almost all children went to church, whether or not their parents did or not. That was commonplace in America. And it was commonplace for people to at least know the general stories of the Bible. But if I were to say a bunch of stories that are very popular in the Bible, a lot of people would know very little about them. Like if I ask somebody the story of David and Goliath, it is very unlikely that the average person will have any idea about the story of David and Goliath. Now they might have had her reference to it. I remember when I was in college, I can't remember exactly what year it was. I think it was my junior year maybe. I remember that Kansas was playing Bucknell University, which wouldn't have been all that important except for Bucknell was very close to the college that I went to. It was actually only about 15 minutes away. And I remember the article about that game. I think it was a 3 versus a 14. I want to say Kansas was a 3 and Bucknell was a 14. And the article was David and Goliath. David takes on Goliath, and they were giving Kansas as being David and Kansas being the giant and Bucknell being David. And there was a reference to that. You've probably seen things like that. But there are probably very little people that actually know the story of David and Goliath, where David, through the power of God, is able to take out the giant Goliath and deliver Israel. There are some pretty amazing stories. There's the Hebrew children in the fiery furnace, and likely many people have very little idea about that story. Or Daniel in the lion's den, where it becomes illegal to pray, and Daniel prays anyhow, and he's thrown in a lion's den, except God sends an angel to shut them out. But this is all about spiritual light that we're talking about. Spiritual light. Because there's so little of light spiritually in our society today. There's very little reference to God. If you were to go through all of the main news articles for today, and I've not done it, but I can almost assure you there will be little, if any, references to God. You know why? Because the reality is we are very focused on other things. You know, I spoke to an individual about this weekend, and he was talking to me about Sunday, and of course, obviously, a lot of people are aware that on Sunday this time of year there are a lot of NFL games, and his main objective for Sunday was to sit around and watch the football games. That was he was most excited about, and I have a feeling that even this evening the majority of people are more excited about what's happening on the football field than they are about what's happening in church. Why? Because there's very little light spiritually. They're walking in darkness. And Isaiah says, if you're in darkness, he says, let him trust in the name of the Lord and stay upon his God. But then in verse 11, he's going to compare it to the light of this world. Because this was what Israel was doing. He says, what you're doing, look at this, verse 11, behold, all ye that kindle a fire, that compass yourselves about with sparks. Isaiah says, all you that are kindling your fire, you're trying to set up your spiritual fire, your spiritual light. And he says, what you're doing is you're compassing yourselves with sparks. And that's why we were talking about this issue of sparklers at the beginning and trying to get around with sparks, because it's very difficult. If you are surrounded by sparks, you'll find that it doesn't light very much. They can't see very far. And here they really thought that they were doing well. They thought that their spiritual lives were enlightened, and yet the reality of the matter was they were very far away from God. They were the blind leading the blind, so to speak. And let me tell you what the Proverbs say about a blind leading a blind. You know what happens? They both end up in the ditch. And if you're trying to use sparks for your main light, you're going to have difficulties. But this is what they were doing, and Isaiah says, fine. You want to light your own fire, your own way? He says, go ahead, walk in the light of your fire and in the sparks that you've kindled. You know, there are a lot of people that's their spiritual life in a nutshell. They're walking in the sparks that they've kindled. You ask them the way of salvation, and a lot of people don't really know. They kind of came up with their own ideas about it. What it means to be saved, and if you were to ask 10 people, different people, and of all different religions, what it means to be saved, you would likely get 10 different answers. Why? Because we've got very good at making our own answers and our own rights and wrongs. We've got very good at justifying sin. Things that God says are an abomination and things that God says we should avoid, we got very good at saying they're okay. We've got good at rationalizing the gospel, of making it sound good, of trying to avoid offending people. Besides, there are so many people that will tell you not to judge and not to offend. And the reality of the matter is that serving Jesus Christ is offensive. That pointing out the things of God does cause offense. Why? Because it calls someone into recognition that there is a standard that God has set. It's really the job of the preacher to convey the gospel. The gospel is a wonderful message, a message of peace and truth and freedom. And yet it's also a gospel message that requires us to change our life and to sacrifice and to give God all that we are. You know, a lot of people look at the story of Jesus, and it's an amazing thing that happens. Jesus goes around, he heals the lame, he causes the blind to see, he feeds 5,000 people on one occasion, and 7,000 on another. God works in people's lives. He raises the dead to life again. He does absolutely amazing things. He instructs the people. One of the most famous sermons that was ever preached is the Sermon on the Mount. As God says, blessed are they. And it's known as the Beatitudes. And all throughout Matthew chapter 5 and 6 and 7. And there are other passages as well that reference it where Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It's an amazing thing. Jesus worked. But when we look at what Jesus really did in his life, we find an amazing thing, and that's that he sacrificed everything. He said, not my will, but your will be done. He went to a cross and died for sin and rose again that we could be justified and made free and saved. And yet, that light is so little spread, because when you're living by the light of your sparks, you try to see it from a man's point of view. Now let me tell you the issue with looking at it from a man's point of view. When we look at salvation, we think of something that's powerful. You know, an army, and a lot of people, the reason why a lot of people still in Israel and the Jewish people still don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah was a very simple thing. It wasn't what they were expecting. They were expecting a military Messiah, a Messiah that came and made Israel the most powerful nation in the world and conquered Rome and took over the world and set the kingdom. And yet they didn't realize that Jesus' entire mission was spiritual. That the reality of the matter is that all the military might in the world matters little to the comparison of having a life that's living and breathing in Jesus Christ. That following the will of God is the most important mission for man. That giving our life for God is our greatest accomplishment. But when we have man's wisdom and man's light, we get a lot of what we've had. Where salvation begins to be misunderstood. Or it's say these words after me. And if you can say yes at the right place, and nod your head at the right place, and shake your hand at the right place, and lift your hand at the right place, then they'll say you are a Christian. And you're okay, and that everything's fine. And if you follow a certain subset of rules, and you do this and don't do this, and you come to church and do the things you're supposed to, then somebody will shake your hand and say you're a Christian. When in reality, God has said, if you believe on Jesus Christ, and that God's raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. You see, confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus. Believe in thine heart. It says, for the heart man believeth unto righteousness. With the mouth confession is made into salvation. With the light of this world, I would just hesitate for just a moment to try to help us get a little bit of light in this world. I just mentioned just a few religious positions this evening and only give a very brief summary. It's very difficult to describe an entire religion in just a few sentences, but we'll try just to give a summary. You have the Buddhist religion that emphasizes some state of nirvana, some state of peace that you come into, and that this is basically the thing. And they also they believe in the Buddha and karma and all these things. Then you have like the Hindu religion that believes that you're reincarnated and you come back as something else. And if you're good, you'll come back as something better. If you're not, you'll come back as something worse. And so everyone's striving to do the good things so they can come back as something better in the next life. There's the Islamic religion that serves the God Allah, that really believes that it's a military religion. It's really a bloody religion, an angry God that they serve. And all these different rules that you have to do, these prayers that you have to make, this special diet that you have to live by. And you pray towards Mecca 5 times a day and all these different things. There's others that you could go on about. There's obviously the Christian religion and the true religion of serving Jesus Christ and allowing the blood of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice and his resurrection to save us from sin. But what we hear so often promoted are the ideals of man. And a lot of times they don't come in the form of religion at all. They come in the form of ideologies. They come in the form of putting certain people on pedestals that are not living godly lives at all. You know what's amazing is we set up role models in our society. This is what we do. We set up role models, and a lot of times those role models have nothing to do with God or things that are good at all. There are a lot of role models that are playing right now in the NFL. Role models, these great football players, and yet we know that there are a lot of football players that have had all kinds of problems with offenses, with run-ins with the police and the law, and some of them have even had jail times and have had serious offenses that were leveled against them, but we lift them up as heroes. I remember the tragedy of the fact that it was probably about 15 years ago or so when the information came out about Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods, obviously the great golfer, and was probably the best golfer that ever lived. Probably still, if we look at his career, probably was. But there was an amazing thing that happened, I believe it was 2010, when all this information came out about Tiger Woods and all these mistresses that he'd had and how he'd been with all these different women, and all of a sudden his image was wiped out. But a lot of people looked up to him and said, this is who we're looking after and patterning our lives after. And we look at this athlete after athlete that we put on pedestals. Sometimes it's been with the singers, probably one of the most popular singers in the current time. Obviously, Taylor Swift and the Swifties, all these different things, these role models that we've set up, and perhaps you can even pick politicians, maybe Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or any one of these politicians that people have lifted up and put on a pedestal and said, pattern your life after them. But you know what you don't hear a lot about? Pattern your life after Jesus Christ. Pattern your life after God. Isaiah says, listen, you're walking in darkness. You're walking in darkness. You know what he says at the end of Isaiah chapter 50, and we're going to conclude here. He says, this shall you have of mine hand. Ye shall lie down in sorrow. Isaiah basically puts to the end of the argument. He tells the end result. He says, listen, if you follow the sparks of this world, the ideals of this world, you kindle your spiritual life after the things of this world, he says you're going to find sorrow. And I think about it, the people that have found sorrow, so many of them. Honestly, a lot of people, they look on their social medias and they look at the different things, but I'll tell you what I find so often is sorrow. People that are hurting. People that have found out the way of this world's hard and cruel and difficult. People that have found that there's very little light in this world. But I want to tell you, if you're lacking light this evening, Isaiah says, come to God. What are you following this evening? Are you following the sparks of this world? Are you following the light of God? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh into the Father but by me. He says, I am the light of this world. Walk while you have the light, lest you walk in darkness. This evening the question is, are we walking in the light? Are you walking for Jesus? Are you walking in the sparks of this world? I pray you've made a decision for Jesus and that he's the ruler and guide in your life. Thanks to all of you who come out. Thanks to you who view the streams. We appreciate your support. Pray that you have a wonderful evening in the Lord. Be prayed up, blessed up, and ready to go up. Have a wonderful night.